You know that moment when something feels overwhelming, and instead of telling anyone, you quietly tell yourself, I'll figure it out. And somehow you always do, or at least you try to. There's a certain kind of person who can be surrounded by people who care about them and still carry everything alone. Not because no one would listen, but because something inside them resists the idea of reaching out in the first place. From the outside, it often looks like independence, strength, even emotional control. But most people never notice what it actually costs, because the world tends to misunderstand this pattern. It praises self-reliance, but quietly labels emotional privacy as distance. It assumes that people who don't ask for help either don't need it or don't feel things deeply. And neither of those are true. In fact, the people who struggle the most to ask for help are often the ones who have learned very early on that their needs were something to manage, not something to express. This is the psychology of people who don't ask for help, and there's more going on here than people realize. On the surface, it might look like a simple preference. Some people are just more private, more independent, less expressive. But underneath that, there's usually a pattern shaped by the nervous system.
Psychologically, asking for help requires a sense of safety. Not just physical safety, but emotional safety. The belief that expressing a need won't lead to rejection, judgment, or disappointment. And that belief doesn't come from logic. It comes from experience. There's a concept in psychology known as attachment patterns. It describes how early relationships teach us what to expect from others, not in words, but in feelings. If someone grows up in an environment where support is consistent, they learn that reaching out leads to relief. Their brain wires connection as something safe. But if support is unpredictable, or if vulnerability is ignored, dismissed, or even punished, the brain adapts differently. Instead of expecting relief, it begins to associate vulnerability with risk. So the nervous system learns a quiet rule. Handle it yourself. Not because it wants to, but because it feels safer that way. Over time, this becomes automatic. Even when help is available, even when people are trustworthy, the body still responds as if reaching out might lead to something uncomfortable. So instead, the person thinks it through alone, processes it alone, carries it alone. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. Research in neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly trying to predict outcomes based on past experiences. It's not just reacting to the present, it's anticipating what might happen next. For someone who doesn't ask for help, the brain often predicts subtle risks. What if I'm misunderstood? What if I become a burden? What if they don't respond the way I need? And even if those outcomes are unlikely, the brain treats them as possible enough to avoid. So independence becomes a form of protection. But this pattern rarely starts in adulthood. It usually has roots much earlier.
Sometimes it comes from growing up in environments where emotional needs had to be minimized, where being easy, strong, or low maintenance was rewarded, not necessarily because anyone intended harm, but because that's what the situation required. Sometimes it comes from being the one others depended on, the one who had to be stable, reliable, composed, the one who learned that there wasn't much space to fall apart. And sometimes it comes from subtle moments that seem small at the time. Opening up and being dismissed, asking for help and being told to handle it, feeling something deeply and sensing that it made others uncomfortable. Experiences like these don't always leave obvious marks, but they shape expectations. They teach the nervous system that vulnerability is something to regulate internally, not something to share externally. So the person adapts. They become observant, self-sufficient, emotionally contained. Not because they don't need support, but because they've learned how to survive without relying on it. And it's important to say this clearly. There's nothing inherently wrong with this way of being. Not everyone is wired the same way. Some people naturally process internally. Some people prefer solitude when things get heavy. This isn't better or worse than being expressive or outwardly dependent. It's just different. But like most adaptations, it comes with both strengths and trade-offs. The strength is obvious. People who don't ask for help are often incredibly resilient. They can navigate complex emotions on their own. They think deeply. They rarely collapse under pressure because they've practiced holding themselves together for a long time. They don't rely on constant reassurance. They don't need external validation to function. There's a quiet stability to them. But the cost is less visible, because when everything is processed internally, nothing is shared externally, which means even the people who care about them the most only see part of the picture. And over time, this can create a subtle kind of distance, not because they don't want connection, but because connection requires exposure. It requires letting someone else see what's usually kept private. And that can feel unfamiliar, even unsafe. There's also a paradox here that most people don't expect. The more capable someone becomes at handling everything alone, the harder it can feel to let someone help them, because asking for help starts to feel like breaking a pattern that's been working, even if that pattern is quietly exhausting. So they continue. They manage, they cope, they carry. And from the outside, it still looks like strength, but inside there's often a different experience. Not weakness, not fragility, just a kind of quiet weight that never fully gets set down. And if this feels familiar, it doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means your mind and body learned a way to keep you steady in environments where that mattered. It means you adapted. And those adaptations don't disappear just because your circumstances change. They stay until something feels safe enough to soften them. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly, in small moments where being understood feels possible, where the response you get doesn't confirm the old expectations, where asking for help doesn't lead to discomfort but to relief. And even then, it doesn't mean you have to become someone who shares everything. It just means there might be more options than there used to be, because the ability to carry things alone is a strength, but so is the ability to not have to. And somewhere between those two, there's a version of you that doesn't feel like they have to prove their independence all the time. A version that can still be self-sufficient without being completely self-contained. If this resonated with you, there's a deeper layer to this pattern that most people never notice, especially in how it shapes relationships without you realizing it. And once you start seeing that, it changes more than you'd expect.